thank you for coming to today's JCI Forum on the global geopolitical situation. As you know, that of the many conferences that are current, one of the most popular series is on the forthcoming clash between China and the United States. The reasoning has to do with the background, not of the rise of Germany in the 1890s, the rise of Japan in the 1920s, and if you want to go back further in the history, the rise of Athens at the time when Sparta was dominant. So there's a lot of talk about what the Thucydides tract. Thucydides is this Greek who wrote a book on the rise, on the war between Sparta and Athens. Is the tract existent, or should it be described as tract? That it is highly unlikely to happen. When you think about the likelihood of a clash, you know for sure that the nature of clash between the big powers changed in 1949. Because in 1949, the Soviet Union blasted its way into the nuclear club, meaning that any confrontation between the big powers after that would be mutually suicidal. So it means that wars, when they occur, take the form of proxy wars. North Korea, Bolivia, where Che Guevara died, Vietnam, close to us, and further a place would be Afghanistan and Angola. So the implication of any Chinese-US clash would be which ASEAN country will become the new America's new Vietnam, and which one would become China's Afghanistan, and who in Malaysia will be the new Rashid Mahdi. What you would have is the same country with different groups competing because of financing from the outside. So that's why we have to talk about the Chinese perspective, Professor Cheah from Peking University, and then talk about the difficult situations that Southeast Asia faces. We have Joseph Liew, formerly of the Rajaratnam School of International Studies, and now the Dean of the College of Arts and Humanities. And we will also have a Malaysia's perspective from Tong, and we will get a realistic assessment from Mr. Jou Yi-Cheng from Taiwan, because Taiwan will be possibly the first place to suffer if the unfortunate clash will happen. Because the Americans have described Taiwan as its unsinkable aircraft carrier in the Pacific. It's unsinkable, but it could be bombed to pieces. Never. So we'll find how this will go. Well, what is likely to spark off a new Cold War? It could be something over Taiwan, North Korea, or the trade war. And if you look at the trade war, why does it happen now rather than 2000? Because the year 2000 was certainly a change. That's when George Bush, in American political debate, the first time the term strategic competitor was introduced to replace Clinton's term of strategic partner. Why has it taken so long for the Americans to launch the Cold War? When Bush got elected, it was very clear who was exactly in his cabinet. You had people like Cheney, Wolfowitz, and the guy at defense, what's his name? Rumsfeld. you had a group of people that were set up to undertake confrontation with another power. Thanks to September 11, that was delayed. But another reason why the trade war was never launched was because the US business community was solidly on the side of working with China, because the American firms were making so much money investing in China. But because of Chinese delay in implementing many of the agreements it had in the 1999 WTO accession agreement, the Americans felt that the Chinese did not live up to their words, and then there was aggressive cyber attacks together with very successful industrial policy. So there's many dimensions of why the trade war has been launched. So today, let us get a better look at what is likely to happen, and let me invite Professor Thye to kick off today's session.
Good afternoon, everybody. A lot of thanks to Professor Wu and Minister Zheng Dong. It's my great honor to be here at Sunway University. Sunway University is very good, but a little bit complicated. So some of us take the wrong entrance. It's something like the situation we are facing is so complicated. It's very difficult for us to distinguish which one is true, which one is false. So today I would like to share some views for my own. It's not a perspective from China. It's just Zhai Kun's perspective. The topic for me is Southeast Asia doesn't need to worry about the Sino-US subsidies trap. So I would like to know how many of you know this term. It's a trap. Maybe the students. If you know this term, please raise your hands. I mean, the students. I know a lot of you are not students. Okay. So it shows the seminar is very popular. This term is very important for the current relations between China and the US. It's the most popular term to describe the current situation between China and the US in terms of the confrontation between the two sides. It's a stronger and stronger confrontation between two sides. So some professor from Harvard University just used this term to say, yes, it's so dangerous for our bilateral relations. So it's very necessary for us to know this trap first. And in China, the academia talk about Sino-US relations, use this term. And even the top leaders of China also mention this term. So because the concern about the cooperation between us. But I want to say this term is not so popular right now in China, because Chinese or the experts just believe this trap may be not a correct term to describe our situation. So why? I have some reasons. The first part of my presentation will introduce our response for this trap. So this theory is realist international relations. It's based on Western regional historic experience. So we believe it doesn't apply to the reality of China's foreign strategy and harmful to get Sino-US relations. There are a lot of reasons. Because this theory on the basis of Western world, the past history, in not current days. Just like the professor mentioned, after in the wake of the year 1989, the world is changed, and it's highly impossible for the big powers to have a war because we have new nuclear weapons. So the past experience may be not a proper concept to see the current China-US relations. So that's why this term or this concept is not so correct for us. There are many reasons for the critical thinking of this trap. So because I only have 15 minutes, so I will neglect this this part. But very briefly, the geopolitically, it's a European or Western area, and for the nature of the conflict is changing. So some reasons about that. A lot of them, if we discuss after the presentation, I'll give you more information about that. The question is, how should Southeast Asia to look at the confrontation between China and the US? So I give some perspective of my own. Currently, we see a very pessimistic feeling from Southeast Asia. The most important evidence is from the Defense Ministry of your country, from Malaysia, because this time I was invited by Defense Ministry of Malaysia to talk about the coming white paper for the defense. So it's a very important work. On one hand, it's a responsibility for Malaysia new government. On the other hand, they show a transparency of the new government. So it's very necessary for us to have a public debate of what's the perspective of the security. So how the Malaysia evaluate the security environment in regional or in the world. So it's very necessary. But the topic we discuss is navigating the risks of Sino-US suited traps. So its response, its implication is there is a deep concern from of the confrontation between China and US. It's very reasonable for Malaysia or other Southeast countries to prepare the worst scenario. So they use this term of the trap. But for me, I don't think it's so pessimistic. Maybe we should have an optimistic attitude about that. So we would like to know what's the concern from Southeast Asia, particularly from Malaysia. Maybe when Malaysia is facing the confrontation between US and China, the concern is the current structure of the region may be destroyed. Currently, we see it's a balance of power, with US inside, with China inside, and India, Japan, Russia, all the powers inside. It's something very balanced. But if the intents of Sino-US relations, maybe the structure, the stable structure will be destroyed. Maybe it's a worst scenario. I know most of you don't believe there will a war in Southeast Asia between China and US. I don't believe the long-term trade war between China and US will be a damage to Southeast Asia, because most of the Southeast Asian countries can benefit from the trade war between our two countries. So I think the structure may be the most important. And then I think Southeast Asian countries concern the dominant role between China and the US. So if China and if US want to play a dominant role in this region, so how about Southeast Asia? In the past 28 years from the year of 1991, the ASEAN, the organization of this region, established a structure like the ASEAN Plus, something like ASEAN Plus China, ASEAN Plus Japan, Korea, US, Russia. So ASEAN is just in the center of this structure. So we call it ASEAN Plus structure. So a lot of institutional cooperation among Southeast Asia and other big powers. So if US and China want to competed for the dominant role in the region in terms of security. For example, the South China Sea issue. So where is the position of Southeast Asia? I still remember in the administration of Obama, of US, when China and the US discussed the issue of South China Sea. So the role or the position of Southeast Asia was marginalized. So it should be a problem between China and Southeast Asian countries, but right now it's a problem between China and the US. So it's in terms of security. And in terms of the economy, China had a Belt and Road Initiative. So Trump has his own economic cooperation initiative. But in this region, in terms of economic cooperation in East Asia, so RCEP, it's dominated by ASEAN. But the dominant role of US and China in terms of economy, the consequence of that will be the marginalization of ASEAN. So in short, the centrality role of ASEAN in this region will be weaker and weaker. So it's a real concern from the ASEAN side. So this is the reality of the concern of a Southeast Asia country. But the reality is, when compared, we use the comparative studies, but you can see in terms of security, the current security situation in South China Sea is better than before. And in terms of economy, there are a lot of economic corporations. So it's not a real threat for Southeast Asian countries in terms of China and the US confrontation. So the real concern for ASEAN maybe is Malaysia or Southeast Asian countries can still be able to control this region or make a regional governance by yourself. So this is a real concern. So these are scenarios of the Sino-US conflict. If we see the concern of Southeast Asia, we can see it not so real, but it's highly possible. The concern of Southeast Asia is rising than before because of the intense between China and the US. But I want to say is Southeast Asia doesn't have to worry too much about the conflict between China and the US in this region. Because we pay much attention to the vulnerability of Southeast Asia, but we neglect the self-resilience or strategic resilience of Southeast Asia. There are several reasons. The first, after so many years communication, I think Southeast Asian countries are very good at play the power games among big powers. So in this region, you experience the Vietnam War, and after that, we are going to the period of the Cold War. And in the wake of 1991, there is no war in Southeast Asia. So Southeast Asia maybe have very magical methods to make this region more stable or peaceful. So just like Kishore Mahbubani mentioned, this former dean of Lee Kuan Yew School, he means there is a peace ecosystem in this region. So it's some wisdom of Southeast Asia. It's the first reason. The second reason, there are a lot of institutional cooperation between ASEAN countries and the big powers. In terms of China, we have CAFTA, China ASEAN FTA. We have the TAC. TAC is a treaty of amity and cooperation. China joined this treaty, so it means China will not use force to solve the problem between China and Southeast Asian countries. And China also has the COC negotiation. It's from the DOC to COC. So DOC is just a political promise, but COC is it's a future growth for us. So Premier Li Keqiang visit Singapore last year, at the end of last year. So he mentioned we should end the negotiation for COC in the 3 years. So a lot of institution cooperation between us. So in this region, we have some basis of a peace. We have some methods to deal with the conflict between China and the U.S. So we are talking about the Malaysia's status and its national defense white paper. If I can say something about that, I know Malaysia is preparing a white paper for your defense strategy. Maybe it's the first time. It has 3 levels of implication. First, it's a national level. Maybe it's the first time. I just mentioned it's a responsibility, it's a transparency necessary to publish a white paper. And give the people a clear direction or picture for your national strategy for the future. So the second level is a regional implication. So if Malaysia has a defense white paper, it means maybe it's the first country in this region to have your own security strategy. So maybe I'm a Chinese. I just think the new government of Malaysia will have a leading role to think about the current situation, regional security situation, or the world security situation. So it will have a leading role for that. The third level of this defense white paper is something like we must find the position, the current geopolitical position of Malaysia. Malaysia is not a big country in terms of size or population. But because the geopolitical order is changing, Malaysia is getting more and more important. So there are emerging 2 kinds of systems in the current world. One is the Euro-Asia system. The other is an Indo-Pacific system. Euro-Asia system is a continental order. So Southeast Asia is just on the marginal side of this Euro-Asian system, but Malaysia is the center of this part. For the Indo-Pacific system, Southeast Asia is just in the middle of this system, and Malaysia is the center of this system. So Malaysia is just in a position of overlapping place. So it may be a new starting point for the 2 systems. One is the Euro-Asia system, the other is the Indo-Pacific one. I don't think Malaysia people notice that. So it will be very important. So Malaysia right now is not a national one, is not only a regional one, but also a world one, because it's so complicated. The characteristics of Malaysia is so unique. So we know the characteristics of Malaysia. So I just give some advice to the white paper. So first, don't overestimate the Sino-US conflict. The second, don't underestimate your country and your region. Third, recognize your important position in the new geopolitical situation. The fourth one is to play a constructive role in Southeast Asia, for Malaysia. So my last words is Malaysia in the future is a middle power or not. Usually, the people like to use middle power to describe the position of Malaysia, but I don't appreciate this term. I would like to create a new term for Malaysia. It's something like a connected or connectivity power. It's the position of Malaysia. It's just like a Sunway University. Sunway University lies in a city, Sunway City. Sunway City is a smart city. Everything is connected and very advanced. Maybe it's the future scenario for the Malaysia. But when you come to Sunway City, when you come to the University of Sunway, it's very very complicated. Just now we mentioned it's very difficult to find the correct entrance. So right now, Malaysia is also on a crossroad. So it's very important for you to distinguish which direction is right, what kind of role you will play. So if you, Malaysia, play a role of a connected one, connected with all kinds of civilization, all kinds of religions, ethnics, the cultures, all the geopolitical structures, all kinds of economic corporations, I think the position of Malaysia will be very important and even more important than before. So I will finish here. Okay, thank you.
Next speaker is Joseph Liew of the Nanyang Technological University.
Good afternoon, everyone. Let me just, well, first let me thank you for coming this afternoon, and thank you for this invitation to speak to all of you. I think you can hear me, right? I probably don't need the mic. I just want to make a few points over the 15 minutes. The first is, if I can pick up a point that Prof. Wu had mentioned. He asked the question of why the trade war now? Okay, we start with the assumption that the trade war is causing a bit of tension in our region. So why now? It's a very important question, and I think the answer lies in a number of things. The first is really, in my view, the worldview and the outlook of the President of the United States, the current President of the United States, right, Donald Trump. Donald Trump is the quintessential anti-Obama. That's the first thing we need to understand. Everything that Obama did, he wants to undo. Everything that Obama didn't do, he wants to do. Okay, and his position from the very get-go is that the Obama administration was soft on China. If you look at there's this think tank called the SP, not the Australian one, ASPI, the Asia Society Policy Institute. They have a security studies arm that is headed by Kevin Rudd, the former Prime Minister of Australia. They devised this algorithm to count the number of times the word China appeared in the campaign speeches of Donald Trump, and I think it was about 6,000 or something like that. You know, and by the way, the number of times ASEAN appeared was once. Okay, so it tells you a bit about where his priorities lie, right? He's the quintessential anti-Obama. He is also someone who feels that he has a very conservative worldview as far as globalization is concerned. Right? He doesn't like globalization. He doesn't like trade. Trade is something that you only enter into on purely transactional grounds to ensure that you win more than your trading, your dialogue partner. Okay? And when he looks at the figures of trade with China, he only looks at the balance of trade figures, right? And it's of course skewed towards China's advantage, right? China sells more to the US than US sells to China. I think that speaks a lot about the consumption culture of the US, but we will not talk about that. He doesn't take into account the balance of services, right? That the US sells far more services to China than China has to offer for the US, but that he doesn't take into account. So he's got a very transactional approach. He wants to pressure both friend and foe. And if you put yourself in Donald Trump's position, you would not be faulted for actually coming to a conclusion that what I'm doing actually works, right? You look at, take Europe for example, take NATO, okay? What was Trump's grievance towards NATO? That NATO was not paying for his defense. The Americans were paying for European defense, and Europeans were free riding on the US. What did that trigger? That triggered a lot of displeasure among the leaders of NATO, but significantly, it also triggered a revamp of force structures in many European, many NATO militaries, including Germany, and they are pushing up, they're ramping up their defense expenditure. You look at North Korea, okay? Trump was of the, don't talk about the bromance now, but 2 years ago or 1.5 years ago, Trump was ready to go to war with the Rocket Man, right? And Trump managed to get the Chinese to impose sanctions on North Korea. It was something that all his predecessors struggled to do, get the Chinese on board. China is one of the shall we say, one of the keys to the problem of North Korea. And Trump managed to get the Chinese to do what his predecessors failed to do. Iran, there are many examples, okay? Trump believes that his foreign policy is working. So, if I'm pressuring the Chinese, I'm going to succeed because I will get the Chinese to do what I need them to do, right? Point number 3 on what Trump is doing. You look at his on what he's doing vis-a-vis China and why he thinks he will win. You look at the Trump cabinet, okay? Here's something very interesting. We all know, right, the number of resignations and dismissals and etc. is astounding, is bewildering. With one exception. You look at his trade and economics team. His key trade and economic people are the same people he started with, right? Who are they? Lighthizer, Peter Navarro, Steve Mnuchin, Wilbur Ross. They're all still there, right? State, gone. DOD, gone. National Security, NSA, gone. But his key trade and econs advisors are the same people. And you look at how he talks about his trade and econs team, he nowhere verbally abuses them the way he did Rex Tillerson, the way he's doing now with Mattis, with Kelly, etc. Okay? So what that means is, as far as China trade and economics is concerned, it's all aligned. It's all aligned in Washington, which means it's not going to change anytime soon. Okay? We know trade is not the only issue. I think it's quite clear now that the big concern is trade is really not just part of the puzzle, but a very small part. Trump has targeted the technology sector, right? For obvious reasons. Technology is what gives the United States its leading edge, and is what the United States will need to maintain that edge going into future, right? And China has made it very clear that it wants to catch up, if not overtake, the United States, and it's making a lot of progress. You know, let me give you a couple of interesting statistics from compiled by the National Science Foundation in the US. You know, the United States, since the Second World War, since the end of the Second World War, has been the foremost technology and innovation power, right, in the world, from 1945 all the way until today. They did that on the back of a graduating engineering cohort every year that comprised 4.6% of every graduating cohort. You know, the last 10-20 years in China, 30% of every graduating cohort are engineers. 30%. And that's only from Chinese institutions, you know, not counting Chinese studying in Australia, studying in the US, studying in Singapore, in Malaysia, in other parts of the world. So the Chinese are investing very heavily into this. You want to talk about investments. When Trump came to power, he did something that I feel fundamentally set the United States actually backwards as far as the technology race is concerned. he introduced legislation, or he pushed legislation to reduce the visas, the duration of visas for graduate students. I remember that. Last time you can go up to 5 years. Now every year you have to renew. Okay, and that has created a lot of problems for graduate schools. Why is that significant? I tell you why it's significant. You know, it is estimated that the cost of funding a student from birth in the US, from birth all the way to graduation with an undergraduate degree, is on average about $200,000 US dollars. Right? Now, you think about it. You take in graduate students, you save $200,000 US dollars in taxpayer money, right? Because the money to prepare this student for graduate school is not coming from your tax base, it's coming from someone else's tax base, right? $200,000. Chinese students, on average, more than 100,000 graduate students a year. That means you save your tax base $20 billion. That's a lot of money. That's a lot of money. But of course, he doesn't calculate that way. You know, he just wants fewer Chinese students in the US. There is a security dimension to that, no doubt. That one is quite clear. But on the other hand, a lot of the technology that the United States has managed to develop and develop successfully has been on the back of R&D by Chinese graduate students. Right? I have to think about this because I'm in the education business, right? So the tech war, nevertheless, is going to be a big problem because the Chinese government, or at least the Chinese President Xi Jinping, has made it very clear. It's made it very clear that this is foremost on his agenda, right? Made in China 2025, and here is where I am a bit concerned because as a Southeast Asianist, I would like to be optimistic. Zhai Kun, I would like to be optimistic, but my concern is that Trump is not walking back on the pressure that he is imposing on the Chinese. In fact, he is going to ramp it up. And we all know also that it is a bipartisan position as far as China is concerned. So it will outlive him, or outlive his tenure at least. And we also know that China, and Xi Jinping in particular, cannot afford to stand down because he has invested so much of his credibility and reputation and the entire idea of the rejuvenation of the great Chinese nation on what? On Made in China 2025, on economic growth,
China dream.
on the China dream, exactly, on the BRI. All these are sort of a signature, you know, these are Xi Jinping initiatives. So his political legitimacy and credibility are at stake with these initiatives, and Trump has pinpointed them. And in fact, he had gone so far to say that I don't like the Made in 2020, Made in China 2025. Get rid of it. How can he get rid of it? Right? Trump has not given Xi Jinping an off-ramp, as they call it. And that, I think, to me personally, that is the biggest source of concern. You squeeze your adversary, but you gotta give him an exit, right? You gotta give him a way to exit in a face-saving way. Trump has not done that. Okay, Trump is digging in. Xi Jinping is forced to dig in. We have a problem, Southeast Asia. Okay, so what can we do in the wake of this situation? We can run and hide, but of course we shouldn't do that. I think when we think about what options there are for Southeast Asia, I think a number of things stand out. The first is we really have to hang tighter together as a region, right? As the saying goes, you either hang together or you hang alone. Okay, and I don't know about you, I would rather hang together, right? So integration, building and reinforcing the ASEAN community, I think is quite critical. Yeah, it is a challenge for the region because we have our differences bilaterally, ships appear in Singapore waters out of nowhere, and airplanes land in funny angles and all that. But the important thing is that we should not let these differences distract from the bigger picture of what we as small states in Southeast Asia are confronted with. Okay, that I think is quite critical. We talked about the Thucydides trap and the Peloponnesian War, and I spoke about this a bit yesterday. I find that historical analogy interesting and useful, if only to help us think about the situation we are in now. Because what is striking about the Peloponnesian War, if you all read the Million Dialogue, which is where this analogy is extracted from, it was about Sparta and Athens, but it was not only about Sparta and Athens. I remember it is about two alliances. It was about the Peloponnesian alliance against the Delian alliance, the Peloponnesian League against the Delian League, right? What happened was the big players, Athens and Sparta, dragged small players into conflict. Okay, they dragged small players into conflict, and small players suffered as a result of that. Okay, so that's the price you pay if you so-called choose sides, right, between China or the US. So this notion of choosing sides is, I think, it's a real challenge. It's a real challenge for Southeast Asia, but it's a problematic one. It's also problematic on a number of other counts. I always feel from a sort of ethical, philosophical perspective, if I may, if a great power forces a small state to choose sides, it tells you as much about the intent of their great power as it does about the situation that small states are confronted with. Okay, so if big powers compel small states to choose sides, it basically, to my mind, demonstrates a tendency towards bullying on the part of big powers. So back to my first point, hanging together, staying together is all the more important in the wake of a bully in the region. Yeah, and a final point about choosing sides is I am a proponent of not choosing sides, but we need to distinguish between choosing sides and taking a principled stand. Okay, these two are not mutually. They're not the same. They're not the same. You can decide to stay neutral on issues, but you can take positions on specific issues as they relate to your national interests, as they relate to your principles, as they relate to international law. Okay, so that's very important. That's very important for us. All the more important for small states to bear that in mind, right? It doesn't mean that, oh, because you're small, another country is much bigger than you just sort of lie down and let them run over you. That cannot be the case. That cannot be the case. Okay, so I think moving ahead, Southeast Asia does have some serious challenges. I would like to think that we don't have to worry about Sino-US relations, but my head and my gut tells me we do have to worry, and we have to take it very seriously because things probably will get worse before they get better. I'm not saying that the two countries will launch a military battle with each other. They won't. But even a trade war, for example, is very damaging for Southeast Asia. Chinese exports to the US, up to 50% of components come from Southeast Asian countries. So that alone tells you the kind of exposure and vulnerability we have to the ongoing trade war. Trump might be tweeting that they are close to a deal, but again, if you look at his the comments and remarks made by his economic advisors, they have all said that no, we are nowhere near a deal with the Chinese. Okay. So on the happy note, I will end. And thank you, Professor.
preserved. And now we come to a country that has its site chosen for it. And please.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Jou Yi-Cheng from Taiwan, Taipei. As Dr. Wu just said, a country that have chosen side, we have chosen on our own side. That is on Taiwan's way of living and way of democracy. And I think it's rarely to discuss about the value thing when we talk about international strategy or economy. But after all, we have to understand that how a nation decide its grand strategy actually is not based on the short-term, the gain and loss on the trade or the short-term economy thing, but mainly on the political leaders and the political elites of the nation, what they choose for the value for the nation. That is the fundamental goals, or what they really affect they choose their grand strategy. So for me, I'm also a student of international relations and international policy. I was educated in Washington. So I should be very pragmatic and realistic. But when talking about this grand strategy thing, we really have to understand. We have to understand to the very, very fundamental. That is the value thing. It's a value thing that really decide or what we choose, but not the so-called the short-term gain and loss. So I would say that I would like to let you know that what is the fundamental of this very big and important issue about China rights and its impact to the whole Asia region. Because everybody knows that Taiwan standing on the very first front, confronting China's expansion. So, but when Dr. Wu said that Taiwan would be bombed into pieces, I'll tell you that we'll be fine. So don't worry about us. I think Southeast Asians are good friends. You should worry about yourselves, because I think Taiwan has already choose what it believes, and then the Taiwanese people will be fine. I think we'll be fine. Yeah, and although it looks like Taiwan is a very weak nation, but actually we are not so weak. The military power globally ranked about ranking from like 24 to number 10. So it's a small country, but it is not so weak. And for some certain degree, we will and we can defend ourselves. But of course, we need our allies' support, not just ourselves, because no anybody can defend big China with your own power, right? That's for sure. That's also the same thing for Malaysia. If someday you go to conflict with China, then you also need ally to support and help to defend you. So it's same thing to Taiwan, right? Yeah. So the Taiwanese people, they have chosen democracy, and it's a long-term struggle. Taiwanese people has aspired for human rights and for modernization 100 years ago, since the 1920s, when Taiwan was still under Japanese colonization. And after 1945, when the Chiang Kai-shek's military, the Kuomintang government came to Taiwan, there's began a very long martial law regime. And in the 1980s, Taiwan began its rapid, very quick process of democratization. So Taiwan was praised as a beacon of democracy and human rights in Asia. And it is the vibrant and very, although we cannot say very successful, because I was a student activist back in the 1980s, and we fought for democratization. So we have a lot of criticization. We are so not satisfied with our democracy, democracy now. But of course, when you compare to other nations, Taiwan is still a vibrant and successful democracy. So the Taiwanese people, they will do anything they can to defend what they enjoy now. And because the PRC, they want to change the status quo, but Taiwan is on the defense side. So it's not Taiwan that want to change the status quo. Actually, after 1996, when Taiwan had its first presidential election, each president of Taiwan, they guarantee to the international society that we will maintain the status quo. We will not change the status between the Taiwan and the PRC, the close trade relations. We want to keep it peace, and we just want to be on our own. We don't want to be so-called reunified by the PRC. And the Taiwanese people want to keep their own rights to choose, to make decisions. That's just very, very simple and very fundamental, and so not a very unreasonable decision, right? So that is the real situation between Taiwan and PRC. So this is the nature of the problem. So when we want to see the whole situation, and when we want to find out some solution, we need to look into the nature. The nature is such thing. It's a value thing. The Taiwanese people choose their value. So simple. Yeah. So it is the PRC that want to change the status quo, but is the Beijing's ambition, or we call it a more a moderate or objective term, their objective, is it necessary, or are they really have to do that? Actually, it's unnecessary for Beijing to use any force to force Taiwanese people to change their choice. It's not necessary, because Taiwan is there, and the Taiwanese people, most of the Taiwanese people are ethnic Chinese. They speak a Chinese language, and they share the cultural origin with mainland China. So no one really denies it. This is for sure. And Taiwan is there, just 160 or 200 kilometers away from Fujian. So it's not really an aircraft carrier. An aircraft carrier, you can drive it away. But since it's an unsinkable carrier, so the carrier is there, it cannot go away. So China has no really justification to use any force against the Taiwanese people, because it's there, it's not going away. The only thing that China should worry about is its democracy, because China do not want this Taiwanese democratic system existing there, and continue to make a comparison to the I would call it 倒车, how do I put it? Reverse. Yeah, reverse. Because in the 1990s, China has been became more open and open, but now it's getting worse. So it does not like this comparison there, because they share the same origin of culture, the same language. So that is how this comparison is so important. And also the other thing is that only if PRC wants to compete with the United States as the dominating power of the world, or say the Pacific Asia region, and then Taiwan can be a problem. Otherwise, Taiwan is no problem at all, right? For PRC's open and reform, Taiwan has been the major investor, and the talents and all the technology, all the firms, all the industries, they go to China. So Taiwan had helped China's open and reform quite a lot. We can say that without Taiwan's contribution, it's not possible. We see that China's economy has been grown such in a soon time, right? It's for sure. So Taiwan is never a threat to PRC. Never, never. Taiwan has never used any missile, want to bomb China. There is no such thing. And Taiwan leaders, they never use any rhetorics to threat the PRC leaders. So there is no such thing. Taiwan is not a threat to China. It's only that Taiwan's system, as a comparison, will be a trouble for the authoritarian or dictatorships in Beijing. And also, when China wants to expand its influence and compete with the United States, so when China wants to 争霸, want to be the hegemon, want to be the dominating power, and then Taiwan began to be a problem. So that's for sure. So China, the PRC, I would say PRC because China is a confusing word, right? Just like Chinese. Chinese is a very, very confusing word. I know that in whole South Asia, it's troubling because when you say you are Chinese, you don't know, that means you are ethnic Chinese or a PRC citizen. It's confusing. So for some 10 some years ago, I have suggested a term like 华人. Huaren. Use Huaren as the equivalent for ethnic Chinese. So Huaren is better than Chinese when we talk about Chinese. So I would say PRC. Because PRC wants to expand its control over the whole Southeast Asia. And then the naval power of PRC is already, in terms of the quantity, is already past the United States. So it's already a very strong maritime power in this region. So it's really a problem. So that's what I say. The Taiwanese people, we are fine, but our friends in Southeast Asia, you should worry about yourself, because although China or the PRC, they do not have a territory claim over you, but all the economic and security issues in the future, you will begin and you will face a lot of maybe at the beginning look like small problems, but the problem will be bigger and bigger and more. So that's when the naval power of China expand and getting stronger. So I think for our friends in Southeast Asia, it's really time to worry. But I'm not advocating a China threat, but it's just like the Thucydides trap thesis. It's the nature. It's the nature of power that can create all the problem. It's not the intention, or if or if I'm saying that the leaders in Beijing, they are all evil people, they want to, control everyone in the world. I'm not saying it's not possible, but I'm saying it's not about the intention, but the reality. So I think the regional security is very, very important. And I think everybody in Southeast Asia should really consider Taiwan people as your ally, because they are your ally. Taiwanese people are really your ally. Taiwanese people stands a lot of sharing values with you, and there are many your business and your people working in Taiwan, and also many Taiwanese firms investing in your country. And then there are now more and more student exchange and cultural exchange among the region, all the countries with Taiwan. So Taiwan is really your ally. It's not a slogan. It's a real thing. Yeah. So should see Taiwan as a very good, very strong ally, stand between you and PRC, right? So it's a good friend, okay? And I would suggest that you should improve, enhance the maritime power of your military. I understand that for some historic reasons, the army is the biggest in Malaysia. And it's reasonable. It's for the historical reasons. But if you consider the future development of Malaysia, and I think a bigger navy is for your own national interest. It's so very important, because yesterday I was in the Defense Ministry. I dare not to say that because there are so many generals sitting there. I feel that as a guest I should be polite enough, so I didn't say that. But because you are not, there is no uniform people here, only the deputy minister here. I think you should consider that. You should reconsider the grand strategy of building a bigger navy, and then you should consider more military cooperation with the United States, because I'm not saying that the United States is definitely a benign power. I'm not saying that. I'm saying a rebalance of the region is very important, and it's critical to your own national interest. It's a vital national interest. So it's not about to help the United States or helping others. It's about your very own survival. So I think you should improve your cooperation with the United States to introduce more balance of power in the region. And by doing this, I think it's not against the PRC's own interests. Actually, I truly believe that a military expansion of PRC is not in Chinese people's own interest, because there are many things for the Chinese government. They have a lot of urgent things to do. To compete for the world superpower is certainly not the urgent priority for PRC. So it's not for their people's own interest. Actually, as they expand more military in the world, the situation of the economy and the situation of human rights in China will be getting worse. So I think for those countries sharing similar values and similar interest in the Asia-Pacific region, we should work together to build a stable alliance, and then a good structure, and that is really helping China, because we have to guide and to doing containment and doing engagement all together, and to create some sort of a framework, a guidance, so that the PRC government can do the right thing. Otherwise, they can choose a wrong way. So I think it's in our hand, and it's very important. So this is my view sharing with you. Thank you.
I'm Liew Tong. Hopefully I can be quoted as Liew Tong and not Deputy Defense Minister. Because yesterday I was with Tun Daim, and out of his many paragraphs of speeches, there was one single line on Huawei 5G, and it became the title of many news articles, which I don't think reflect the spirit of his speech yesterday. Anyway, good afternoon. I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the presence of former Minister Ong Tee-Kiat, and also my fellow panelists, all my friends from with different nationalities, but yeah, all good friends. Joseph, Yi-Cheng, Zhai Kun, and Prof. Wu. I have 5 points to make, and hopefully within 15 minutes. My first point is that we are looking at a totally different era compared to the time when Berlin Wall fell. The fall of Berlin Wall ushered an era which is now ending. The 30-year 30-year era has ended, and we are now in search of a new era, and in search of a new architecture. So I want to make 2019 is 30 years after the fall of Berlin Wall. The fall of Berlin Wall and the subsequent collapse of the USSR basically created a world in which the United States was the superpower, was the only or sole superpower, with many other actors, but United States as the only superpower. I think we are looking at into a situation where United States will remain quite strong. Trump or post-Trump, whoever comes in, even with US withdrawing, and even with US not being able to enforce all its intended guarantees to overseas partners and allies, still the US will still be quite strong. But the US is no longer the only superpower. China will be getting stronger, and that is a fact. That is something that is going to happen. But China will not be the only superpower in foreseeable future. In foreseeable future, US is still quite strong, and you have China being a strong contender, but China in foreseeable future will not be the only superpower. It won't be a situation of early 90s. And you have Russia, Europe, Japan, India, all playing very important role, and sometimes independent of US in their approach and in their outlook. And you have many other middle powers. I don't know how to categorize the second tier powers. Russia, Europe, Japan, India. I don't know how to categorize them. Perhaps you can call them second tier power. Some people may dispute and think that Russia is still a superpower or a big power equivalent to the United States. I mean, these are all, we will leave it to the academics to do the categorization. And then you have middle powers, perhaps Australia, Indonesia, Turkey, South Korea, and perhaps Malaysia aspiring to be some sort of middle power, not so much from the point of military might, but from the point of persuasion, and from the point of trying to punch above its weight in terms of influence globally. So, point number one, as I say, the world is a different place. We need to look for new way of structuring, or we need to look for new architecture for our world. The second point that I would like to make is that during that period of time, since 1989, there was a whole period of time in which the neoliberal idea of separating the state from economy was quite prominent. The Washington consensus was basically the overarching idea that governs most part of the institutions. So the separations of economy from other institutional setup is somehow the guiding ideas of the time. But China, in many ways, was doing what England was doing during industrial revolution, was doing what United States was doing when around the war during Franklin Roosevelt's time until the Ronald Reagan revolution. So China was using its industrial policy in order to create this rise. So basically, China combined economic power and political power. The state, in many ways, influenced economic decisions and with long-term planning. But so that is, in many ways, China weaponized the economy for a long period of time during this last 30 years, when United States did not do so. But now, if you follow what Vice President Pence said at Hudson Institute, you realize that in many ways, in the inner circle of Trump, and particularly with Vice President Pence's speech, it is about weaponizing the economy in order to deal with China, which combines the political and economic power as one. Now, what would be the consequence? The consequence is, I'm very familiar with Australia, and let me share with you two stories about Australia to illustrate my point. I was a student at ANU, Canberra, around between 2001 and 2005. And one day we were among a group of students who are called International Student Ambassador. A group of 20 of us. We were given periodic tour of Canberra. And one day we were taken to the office of John Howard, the Prime Minister's office. Prime Minister was not there, but we were given a tour into the Prime Minister's office. Now, Prime Minister John Howard was known as a conservative. And we were looking at the photos lined up behind his table. By the side, it was Bill Clinton and Tony Blair. And this was in 2002. This was in 2002. The photos, and John Howard was in power between 1996 and 2007. So by the side, it was Tony Blair and it was Bill Clinton. Moving into the center, it was Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, and at the core, the most central photo was an old soldier, at that time the living Anzac soldier. For those who understand Australian politics, Anzac means a war during First World War I, and in 2002 there was still someone who was living from the 1917 war, and it was the old soldier's photo. But next to the old soldiers, and that was to illustrate John Howard's conservativeness, his commitment to Australian war tradition. But at the center as well, next to Alec Campbell, the old soldier's photo, was Jiang Zemin's photo. President Jiang Zemin's photo. And it took us some time to try to interpret what it means. See, John Howard's period of office never overlapped with Tony Blair. I never overlapped with Margaret Thatcher or Ronald Reagan, but he overlapped with Tony Blair and Bill Clinton. But he thinks that they are outside. But at the center in Australians' politics is both war, the war memorial tradition, the war tradition, the conservative politics. But at the same time, it was about China's money. It was about having deal with China. So that was 2002. I went to Australia October last year for the first time as Deputy Minister of Defense, but I've been in and out of Australia. This time someone told me, they say, we have to be very careful about students from China. Because 60% of, maybe correct me if I'm wrong, but 60% from what I know, of Australians' international students are students from China. So most Australian universities are dependent heavily on funding from tuition from students from China. So they say, yeah. So I say, are you? So I was very naughty. I say, so are you thinking of raising taxes in Australia? Because how do you pay for university in Australia if you do not take tuition from students from China? Now, this is where making choices is not just about nation, but at some point it will influence how society will have to change. If the Australian society is prepared to be more stringent in its approach towards China, then it may have to raise taxes. It may lead to other consequences. And it may also lead to a conflict between the economic department and the security department. That is something that we may have to deal with, and we are perhaps already dealing with, in which societies, between the economic department and the security department, there might have to be a conflict. But there might also be a synthesis. At some point, if everyone align and when the security department and the economic department align, then we are going into Cold War. Then we are going to Cold War in which everyone align and the sort of economic interdependence of this period of time, the huge and very deep multi-layered economic dependence of our time between 1989 and now would probably have to end. Now that is the consequence of those developments that we may have to be aware of. My third point is, but things may not have to be that bad. It depends on how the actors play or respond to the game. Well, these are the structural issues, but it also depends very much on how China is seeing itself and China is positioning itself in the society and in the region. One of the issues that my third point, and this is my third point, and one of the issues that I think China would have to adjust to a certain extent is that China, like a huge elephant, has to realize that it is big. Because in China's narrative, very often China sees itself as the victim of the United States. So the entire narrative in Chinese discourse is that China is the victim of US and its allies, and therefore China is doing the right thing vis-a-vis the US. Now that in many ways may not necessarily be wrong. Sometimes it's true. Sometimes it's true, especially when everyone weaponizes their economy. What the United States does to China may not necessarily be the most just what they call approach. But the challenge is, apart from the United States and China, there are many small states like Malaysia, Singapore, and other Southeast Asian states. We're small countries. We are small countries in this whole games between China and the United States. And China at some point will have to realize that China is huge. And China is huge compared to Malaysia. Malaysia is indeed a small country in face of China, and we are small. And China will have to handle the small state in a very tender way. This is where I think China at some point will have to realize it is not all just about US and China. It is also about handling very proximate and close small states around China. And very importantly, not to see these countries as proxy of one or the other. Professor Wu started the whole talk by saying that who will be the next America's Vietnam or USSR's Afghanistan. And this is a challenge for China and for everyone else, not to force anyone to make choices, and not to see small independent states as proxy of anyone. Because from our point of view, we would like to see ourselves as an independent player, despite knowing that we might, as Joseph say, we might be dragged into, small state might be dragged into alliances, and eventually once we might be forced to choose side. But inherently, we do not want to choose side. Inherently, we want to maintain as large an independent policy space as possible, and we do not want to choose sides. Whether US or US allies, or whether China or China allies, we actually do not want to choose sides. We want to maintain as much independent space as possible, and this is where I think China can play a role in handling Southeast Asia in a more, in a softer, tenderer way, in order to achieve better outcome for China. I think in the past 6 years under President Xi Jinping, some of the initiatives are quite fundamental in nature. Some of the changes are quite fundamental in nature, but I think they are some of which has more propaganda value than its actual effect. For instance, Made in China 2025, China's approach in South China Sea, and even Belt and Road. There are so much room for China to adjust its approach and to make it softer and more appealing to independent actors, independent small state around China. I give an example, for instance, Belt and Road. Belt and Road, when President Xi Jinping gave a speech in May 2017 in China on Belt and Road, he talks about anti-corruption as part of Belt and Road initiative, and project has to be transparent, project has to be above board. I think those things can be enforced, and it will actually make small state around China feeling far more comfortable than what it is now. For instance, South China Sea, China can insist on 9-9, but may not have to enforce it. China can talk about it, but it may not have to enforce it with present, with actual or assert it. I think these are things that China can adjust, and it will help the region a lot more. My fourth point is about ASEAN. The 1990s was quite interesting. ASEAN used the word centrality. ASEAN was in driver's seat. Of course, sometimes driver is just driver. You drive someone at the back, so you drive the big fellows at the back, and that perhaps sometimes is the case of ASEAN. Yeah, driver's seat, but driving someone bigger. Yeah. But the point is that in 1990s, China was actually not strong, and in many ways, Mahathir brought China back from the sanction, from the boycott after Liew Shi, after Tiananmen, back into the international environment through ASEAN. So all this ASEAN architecture that we see today was very much the creations of that era in which Mahathir, Suharto, Lee Kuan Yew, and Ramos, to a lesser extent Ramos, when they were there and when they were strong, to a large extent they were dictators and or soft dictators, but they were able to work with each other in order to create a rather strong ASEAN. Now we may not have that luxury to a large extent, partly because today we are all mostly we are more democratic than 30 years ago, and many leaders are more domestically focused and focus more on local issues and inward looking rather than looking at global situation. But I think the environment would require all these leaders, particularly with the opportunity of Mahathir coming back as Prime Minister, to actually think of what would best serve ASEAN and the world in the next 20, 30 years. I think it is quite a time for us to think about improving or even thinking of how to run ASEAN with new architecture, or at least to refurbish the roof and change some of the pillars. My final point is that China's rise is inevitable to a large extent. Many people like to compare Japan and Japan in the 80s, and Japan's rise was ended with the Plaza Accord, with the bubble in 1990. But I think China's rise is perhaps well, it will be harder to stop China to rise. We will have to deal with China in the next 50 years. China is our next neighbor. China is our immediate neighbor. We'll have to deal with China in the many decades to come, and we'll have to find a way to work with China in a way that both are comfortable. If China can look at, I talk about 1990s a lot, but before I end, I just want to talk about 1960s. Now, United States in 1960, when JFK was elected, was a very prosperous society. And prosperous on the back of 15 years of economic growth after Second World War. Now, some of the good things coming out of that era is, for instance, Cornell at that time has a good school researching on Southeast Asia. I like to cite the example of Ben Anderson, who wrote the book Imagine Community. I think the 60s produced great scholars like them. In a way, I somehow benefited in a long way via Australia. My professor John Fungston, my thesis professor John Fungston, was a student of Herb Fried, and Herb Fried was a graduate of Cornell, or the Cornell project. So that was a good era in many ways. But at the same time, because the United States inherently did not understand Southeast Asia, and therefore seeing Vietnam as the domino, the first domino, and as the proxy war that Prof. Wu talks about, and the United States ended up in the muds in Vietnam. And this is where I think China and the world can draw lessons from the 1960s. China needs to understand Southeast Asia in a much deeper way. And of course, Malaysia and other Southeast Asian states would have to understand China in a much more deeper way as well. Thank you very much.
Let's have open the floor for discussion. Let me get things started then. We have talked about not wanting to choose sides. And would that happen if the United States and China were to get along very well? The thing is, it is often said, when elephants fight, the grass gets trampled. But it's also true that when elephants make love, the grass gets trampled. It's because if the US and China gets along very well, that means they agree on what the world should be like. And if they agree on what the world should be like, anyone who behaves differently will be roundly punished and be brought back into line. So, when things are very, very good, Southeast Asia has no independence. We have to listen to whatever the Beijing-Washington consensus is. The present situation is clearly a situation of middle-level tensions. Middle-level tensions is actually been very good for us. The Chinese gives us BRI, right? They're willing to pay for the high-priced trains that go from the West Coast to the East Coast, and they're willing. And the United States gives us a TPP in which it basically waives all the difficult conditions we would have to fulfill. Like one of the standards in PPP is state-owned companies should be greatly reduced. And what did they do at GLCs? They said, we cannot have you guys, we cannot start a club without members. So we let you come in and we waive the rules. So it's like everyone comes bearing gifts. But the terrible thing is, if tension is exceedingly high, the attitude would be on each of the big countries is, if you are not with me, you are against me. So our side gets chosen for us, like the side gets chosen for Taiwan at the moment. And that is what Southeast Asia must do. is to prevent tensions from getting higher. And how can we do to prevent tensions getting higher? Hanging together is a good idea, but that is hard to do. The other thing is we have to get a lot richer so that we can afford the best weapons in the world, such that we are able to give a bloody nose to whoever would dare to trespass upon us. So, better yet, we have to talk about a new architecture for ASEAN. YB talks about refurbish the roof and change some pillars. We are talking about changing the foundation on which the house stands. The end of use of consensus in ASEAN, for example. So I would like to invite members of the audience to offer their perceptions. Yes, sir. Kindly identify who you are.
My name is Zhai Kun. Just two short questions for Dr. Joseph Liow and Professor from Beijing. Joseph, you mentioned that Donald Trump was able to get the Chinese to impose sanctions on North Korea. Why did the Chinese agree to do that? What was the consideration? Donald Trump is a deal maker. But having done that, yes, he called Kim Jong-un the rocket man. Now they are BFF, they are best friends.
Oh, he's a DAP man also. No, the rocket man.
They are best friends forever. And suddenly the tensions in Korea have really come down a lot. I think just after Christmas, we had a ceremonial connection of the railway tracks. So we expect more good things to happen in Korea. I think it's a good thing. I'd like to introduce that. The professor from Beijing, so you spoke about a lot of focus on American-Chinese geopolitics. The topic is security framework for ASEAN. While we look at China, US, there's also evolution inside ASEAN countries. For example, increase in radicalism, Islamic, as we say called Islamic radicalism, fundamentalism, extremism, however you label it, which is now seen to be moving into mainstream politics from the sides. It's now coming to the center. How does China look at this? Is it an issue? Is it a point of concern for you? And will it work into the equation of security for ASEAN? Because if you have a radicalized country, for example, government, I'm referring to Malaysia, it may seriously impact how we look at other countries. So, may I have your views?
Not just Malaysia, Indonesia. Look at the arrest of Ahok in Jakarta. And why don't you, Mr. Liew?
Okay, on North Korea, my view is this. I think we know how things appear to have changed 180 degrees, right? I think the biggest winner is North Korea. Kim Jong-un is the biggest winner for a number of reasons. Number one, there's no way North Korea is going to denuclearize and disarm. Okay, 70 years of developing that capability is not a bargaining chip. It is the core of North
regime existence,
States' identity and the regime's stability. So they're not going to give that up. And if you go into a negotiation or if you enter a dialogue with that position in mind, and you have come out of that dialogue, number one, not having to say that you, in any sort of a concrete way that you're going to give it up, no timeline, no nothing. But at the same time, you got your counterpart at that meeting to immediately say that we might consider stopping the exercise. Why are we investing so much in the military exercises on the peninsula, right? And which got James Mattis very upset, and the South Koreans very upset, and the Japanese very upset, and China and Russia, which were forced to go along with international sanctions because they also were concerned about the nuclear test, realize that they can start to relax on the sanctions, because the Americans are no longer pressuring Beijing to stick to the sanctions. And very importantly, around this issue of the negotiation with the US, Kim Jong-un has done something that he was very reluctant to do initially.
This
and
is
that
for
is
the mics.
oh, okay. And that is pay deference to Beijing. Right? When he came to power, he never acknowledged, he never visited Beijing, and Xi Jinping was always, this was always at the back of the minds of the Chinese leadership, right? But he played his hand very nicely. You know, really, I mean, if you want to give a Diplomat of the Year award, in 2018, let's be honest about it. It is to Kim Jong-un. He played the Americans. He played Donald Trump. Not difficult, by the way, but he nevertheless he played Donald Trump. He played the Chinese. He left the Japanese out in the cold. Right? Japan is very upset that the Americans seem to be caving in to North Korea. He has got the South Koreans to conceptualize deals with North Korea. And what did he have to do? He blew up a facility that was scheduled to be dismantled anyway. And that's all. That's all that he's done, you know. And now he's got Donald Trump inviting him to Hanoi for a second summit, you know. And he's gone to Beijing to discuss with Xi Jinping what can and cannot, should and should not be discussed at that summit. Fantastic. This guy is really, a top, he is the new Henry Kissinger.
Well, and of course, he got away with murder in Malaysia.
Ah, yes.
So I will talk something about the role of ASEAN in terms of security architecture building in this region. So we must notice what happened in Southeast Asia right now. We pay much attention to the coming confrontation between China and the US. Yeah, it seems dangerous and dangerous. But we must note the other side of the coin. There are a lot of conditions to make this region more peaceful. So just now, I just noticed China joined the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation. But you know what? America, Australia, Russia, Japan, India, Korea are also members of this treaty. So the goal of this treaty, it means they will never use force to solve the problem. We will never forget that. Yes, there is a security dilemma, but on the other hand, there is limitations against the future conflict. So when some conflict is coming, we should be more brave to face it. And ASEAN should be self-confident. You are so creative to build architecture right now in terms of security. The ARF, ASEAN Regional Forum, the ADMM Plus, East Asia Summit. It's a very professional concept by international relations. I don't know how many of you know this term. It means ASEAN Regional Forum, ASEAN Defense Minister meeting, and East Asia Summit. All the multilateral cooperation, the goal of it is a peace. So why after 1991 we have a peaceful time? It's just because it's your own rule. I can feel there's so many fears from Southeast Asian countries about the future, but I can not feel the self-evidence from Southeast Asia. So you should be self-confident about that. So, okay, one question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Alvin Tan from JCI Group, Malaysian. My question here is to all panel members, especially to our Saudara Liew Tong. We don't call minister because only YB here. So I think it's because you're talking about nation security for ASEAN region. How does Malaysia going to affect it in form of consequences and also in terms of opportunity and in terms of threat at the current scenario where our Malaysian peace government is having a strained relationship with one of the superpower, China, because of the previous administration had planned a lot of projects, and now they are disbanding the project. And our current PM, who is a 94 years experienced man, seems to have a strained relationship with President Xi Jinping. And the panel member comment. Thank you.
You mentioned about 5G just now. You see, the US now, going around the world, asking government to back them on 5G against China in very simple terms. Now, lately, again, because of the 1MDB, Mahathir has gone to Japan to get a very low interest loan, or what you call that? Is that loan or something like that? Bond. Sorry. Samurai bond for less than 1%. Now, I believe that you don't get everything free for dinner. Behind those things is that Japan is a very strong alliance with the US. Instead, when a time point comes, the US will force Japan to then tap the China on the shoulder and say, look, you give Malaysia a very low interest bond, do something about it, about 5G, maybe it's time for you to do it. That's my question to Mr. Liew. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yes, Mr. Liew.
Okay, I don't think Malaysia and China's relationship is strained. I don't think so. I think we are recalibrating in the sense that, as I mentioned, Malaysia wants to have as large and independent foreign policy space as possible. We do not want to be seen as anyone's proxy in the years and years to come. And I think China's leaders are very comforted by the fact that Mahathir is not pro-US. I think that is a baseline for, in terms of China's big power calculation. China's leaders are comforted by the fact that Mahathir is not pro-US, but at the same time, I think Malaysia is hoping and also attempting to have an independent foreign policy space as much as possible. And while noting the relationship between big power and small nation, the idea that Malaysia wants to somehow have some equal as possible in terms of various relationships. I think that is the basic idea. And of course, moving forward, when we talk about big power relationship, there's this idea of equidistant. That means we do not want to be extremely close to China or extremely close to the US. We want to basically be able to say, we're both your friends. We are small and we're both your friends. We do not want you to fight, and of course we do not want, and we will have to, perhaps as some of the panelists suggested, in the years to come we'll have to actively go up and say, please don't fight. It is not necessary that we can stop them, but the position is that, yeah, you don't fight and we don't want to fight, and we're trying as much as possible to maintain equal distance with the big powers, and also to actually have good relationship with other middle powers. As I started earlier, I say the world is not going to see any big sole superpower in the years to come, but at the same time, we have to acknowledge that China and US are big. We also have to acknowledge that they are middle powers which sometimes act in concerted with the United States and sometimes not necessary. I mean, Japan and US usually alike, but it is not necessarily 100% alike. I think this is the world that we are moving into, and perhaps that is something that we are trying to maneuver as much as possible. Not easy, but when I meet friends from China, when I meet leaders from China, one of my messages is that if you want to do any big deals in Southeast Asia, any new architecture with Southeast Asia, try to do it during Mahathir's tenure. I'm not saying this in jest, because Mahathir had the experience of the early 90s, and that experience of the early 90s, perhaps after Indonesia's election in April, perhaps after whatever domestic challenges that different country faces. It is time to think of having a framework that will last us for the next 20 years.
My name is Kim Seong, the best layman. In 1997, Hong Kong was returned to China, and 2 years later, Macau, under the One China, Two Policy system. And today you find that Hong Kong has progressed and is as democratic as it was. And it's, you see Macau, even Macau, the casino has developed to the extent that revenue in Macau is now exceeding even Nevada in the whole of this Las Vegas. So you find that both countries have been able to maintain this democratic system of government. The people, I think, is quite happy there. So can I know from your point of view, from a layman's point of view now, what are the Taiwanese laymen in the street object to this unification with China under the One China Two System policy?
Hello, hi, my name is Arlene. My question is specifically for YB. A lot of the populations in Southeast Asia are Muslim. I wonder, like, with the new government in Malaysia, is there a new position for Malaysia as well as for ASEAN towards the Muslim world, in particular towards Saudi and Qatar?
About the so-called one country, two system. Actually, after 1997, Hong Kong situation, I don't know how do you base your observation, because I think the general sense is that the human rights and freedom in Hong Kong is getting very, very worse. So there were so many protests and very much dissatisfaction in Hong Kong. So that is why, because Hong Kong is an example for many, many Taiwanese people, particularly young people. They know that they take Hong Kong as an example. There is a slogan in Taiwan that don't let Taiwan to be the next Hong Kong. So Hong Kong is the best example for the one country, two system. And so, if you maybe my view may seem like a bit
biased?
Yeah, or unfamiliar to you. But if you go to Taiwan to look at all the young people on the internet or when in their community, the general sense is that although they do not they may choose to go to PRC to work, or they do not against trading with PRC, but politically they never want to be ruled by PRC, or they never want to be part of China. That is why even I, for take my opinion. Sometimes I will criticize by the younger generation that I'm too moderate, because I'm too friendly to China. So you can imagine that the general opinion of the Taiwan younger generation is very much like this.
I think when I talk about middle power, and I say that middle power with persuasion, perhaps Malaysia was somehow in that mode in the early 90s, when Mahathir was riding high, and to a certain extent Anwar was also well known. And in that period of time, Malaysia was seen as an example of a Muslim majority multi-ethnic society for the Muslim world and also for the global South to emulate. Of course, that is a different period, and now if we are doing well, then we can perhaps also add one more criteria, that is Malaysia is now also a democracy. So multi-ethnic Muslim majority democracy in the world of democratic decline, I think that is the project, that is perhaps the Malaysia Baru project, that if we do well, we can play that role. When it comes to Middle East, I think Malaysia will have to understand the Middle East in a deeper way, and also engage with the fast-changing alignment and realignment in Middle East, perhaps since 2015. I think Middle East politics changes very rapidly since 2015. We will have to understand and also move in a way that we are not stick to one or two single ally, but actually more agile and more adaptable to the emerging changes or rapidly changing scenario.
Thank you. Sir?
Mr. Chairman and panel members, I'm Zhai Kun from Malaysia. I'd like to make just a comment regarding the proposal to have a new architecture on the security system. Now, I think we have to, in the first place, before engaging or even thinking about any new architecture, one has to also stop thinking in the old mode, which is thinking about the positions held by the various superpowers or the ex-superpowers. We start thinking in terms of the polarized blocks that we used to have, and it seems to think that it will continue forever, forgetting that Malaysia has been one of the countries that have advocated for the reform in the United Nations itself, which will free the kind of power that the superpowers have in terms of vetoing any kind of proposal made to disengage among nations at war and whatnot. Now, this kind of architecture can only be brought about if you are willing to change your mindset as well. Stop thinking about the same mold that you have been thinking, but think about make a paradigm shift in terms of your mindset. How do you go about thinking without thinking about the existence of such kind of, although they are real. But we have got to start thinking of a new architecture that does not have to continue with the existence of such blocks in the past. That's one. Secondly, we have to bear in mind that relationships among nations are not built just on political relationships. There are relationships such as economic relationship, political relationship, and many other kinds of relationships. So that does not in any way tie down any nation to be a proxy of any nation. Okay? Relationships are built because of to protect the best interests of the nations, the bilateral relations with the nations. Some can be more on economic ties, some can be more on political ties, and so on and so forth. And some on military ties. You talk about weaponizing nations, maybe those countries that are engaging in such kind of relationships are based more on military ties. So there are many kinds of relationship that one has to think about. It doesn't cover everything, okay? So as long as countries like Southeast Asia, talking about the topic that you have here, I think it's not the national security, we're talking about the regional security of ASEAN. The ASEAN is a regional entity. It is not a national entity by itself. It is a regional entity. We're talking about those concerns that some of you have been talking about here is not the expression of ASEAN itself. These are the nations like China, PRC, People's Republic of China, Taiwan, talking about imposing their views on us. We are not so much too concerned about that, but of course we have to be a little bit concerned, but not too concerned. I think this question has been blown out of proportion. Nations like Malaysia are small, no doubt, but I think we are not small in terms of our ability to think of how to take care of a nation. Now, these things about maintaining the region as a neutral region is not in the 1990s alone. I came into the service of this nation in the early 70s. As early as early 70s, there have already been foreign policies and a small and also talk about how to retain this region as a free region from military operations and so on and so forth. Now, I think there is need for Southeast Asian nations, especially ASEAN, to continue the engagement with countries like China, countries like United States, or any other countries to ensure that we can engage with them in a manner which will ensure that our situation will be protected from them trying to dominate in any way they can, in a very subtle way. Now, China and United States have always been doing it in a subtle way. I think all superpowers try to influence other small nations in a very subtle way. We know that. We are all aware about that. We have studied that when we were students in universities. We are fully aware of that, and I'm sure the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Malaysia and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in other ASEAN countries are also fully aware about that. So we have to continue to engage in diplomacy in terms of engagement, continue to talk to them, and put some sense into them as well, that it doesn't serve anyone's interest to engage in, to continue to engage in this kind of the continuation of the Cold War. There's no need for it. Okay? So I think if we put our minds together, we think about the best way to deal with this kind of situation is to engage in diplomacy and to engage in continuous engagement with them. Talk sense about it. But I don't think China or the United States are also not able to rationalize the fact that engagement will serve everyone's interest. Thank you.
Prof, may I direct my question to YB Chin Tong? Well, years ago in the 70s, the acronym ZOPFAN, Z-O-P-F-A-N, which stands for Zone of Peace, Freedom and Neutrality. That was quite popular and familiar to most of us in that era. But unfortunately, over the years, this has become somewhat oblivious. And in the 70s or even 80s, of course, we have reasons to understand that Malaysia coming out with such a notion of ZOPFAN, right? We want to promote this region as a zone of peace, freedom and neutrality. We can leverage on our position in the non-aligned movement, now in NAM. But unfortunately, again, NAM over the years has been oblivious. And now that we have Malaysia Baru, the new Malaysia, are we going to have a paradigm shift? Are we going to jettison the ZOPFAN concept? If so, what is the substitute for ZOPFAN? If not, then how are we going to make it enforceable? This is my simple question. But of course, just now well, I must say that I could see the crossing sword between our two speakers across the Taiwan Straits. To me, perhaps, this may not be the right forum. Because, like, with due respect, like Mr. Cho, your take, of course, I respect your views, but to me, having been familiarized with the narrative presented by the Taiwanese politicians, especially over their TVs, over your Taiwanese media, this is not something new to me. Because to me, this is just the common narrative presented by the mainstream, the so-called the prominent talkers, the talk show hosts. But we would rather prefer to have more contributive take on how are we going to work out a solution in the wake of the potential conflict on all fronts between China and America. I think this is something dear to our heart. Thank you.
My name is Nicola from the Australian High Commission. This is a quick comment on which I would welcome comments from the panelists. In talking about how ASEAN can engage in the face of increased geostrategic competition, we heard quite a bit about strengthening ASEAN itself and hanging together, but less about strengthening the ASEAN plus institutions, although Professor just mentioned the EAS and ARC. So I guess my comment is ASEAN is of course not the only country in the region that is also setting its foreign policy, its economic policy in the face of this increased geostrategic competition. YB Chin Tong gave some anecdotes about how he saw some of this playing out in his time in Australia. And so we have the East Asia Summit, which brings together most of the second tier and middle power countries that you mentioned, YB, already, and the 2015 Kuala Lumpur Declaration, which set out that this is the leaders level forum for discussing the strategic, political, economic challenges shared challenges in the region. We also have APEC, so I would be keen to hear from the panelists a bit more about how we can use those funds.
I think we are not small in ambition, but of course we are trying to take into consideration some of the realities around us. A reform to United Nations is of course great, which the Prime Minister championed in his speech in the United Nations, and this is something that we talk about for years. But of course there are also realities. I think Tan Sri Ong point about Zofan. Surprisingly, now you see the word Zofan in a lot of speeches by foreign minister in the foreign policy motion to Parliament, and actually in the foreign policy paper that is going to come out soon. The word Zofan is being mentioned, and this word has actually been missing for quite a long time, for decades. Partly because I think in the 70s, it was still what they call during the Cold War period, Tun Razak trying to shift away from a pro-US, pro-UK stance to one that is a bit more neutral and non-aligned. And in that, the concept developed in the 70s because of that shift away from aligned positions with US and UK. But I think in the 90s it was more of Malaysia going out to do things. Malaysia in the 90s was very ambitious. Malaysia in the 90s was to go out to use ASEAN together with other ASEAN leaders to build architecture for the region, and not just for the region but for everyone else. I think that was a period of time that symbolizes our ambition. But over the last decade or so, I think we are quite inward-looking. Malaysia as a nation has been quite inward-looking. Now, whether we want to be more ambitious and try to create something for the region and in order to deal with the increasing challenge, I think this is perhaps the time. To answer Nicholas' questions, I think we need to strengthen the ASEAN Plus institutions, but perhaps also at some point explore with respect some ASEAN minus mechanism. ASEAN Plus, but also taking into consideration, I hope I can speak as Liew Tong and not as government's representative, but I think moving forward, we may have to explore some form of ASEAN minus mechanism. ASEAN minus mechanism happens in economic sphere. You sign on when you want to sign on. So only initially some countries started working on it, and 5 sign on, and then someone sign on later. But in terms of security, in terms of political issues, it is very difficult if you say that the only rule is consensus. The only rule is consensus has sustained ASEAN very well, and perhaps majority of what we do should still go back to this basis that consensus should be the base of most decisions. But in decisions that cannot and you will never find consensus, perhaps we may need to explore some flexibility in order to find some position, some common position among like-minded nations in ASEAN.
When I was invited to participate in the forum and to the talk today, I was thinking that what can I offer, what can I contribute to our audience? Because I'm not a Southeast Asian expert. Although I did take some classes by Michael Green, later he became the National Security Advisor in the White House, and some 10, 20 years ago. So all the knowledge of mine, I do not think it's possible to give any helpful advice to you. I think the only contribution for me to come here is that to offer some view that maybe outside of the community that is the professional community that is shaping your policy. My thought is that for making foreign policy, you still have to go to the very fundamental of the nation's goals and nation's values. And you might think that this is not very useful, but for those top leaders, and when they consider the new policy paper or the grand strategy of the nation for like next 10 or 20 or 30 years, this is very critical and very core to their thinking. So although this is for lay people, not just for the policymakers, I think it is still very helpful, or at least interesting for us to think about these very basic issues. And the world is changing, and also the Southeast Asia is changing. So we hold some views from the past, but we still have to try to see the vision for the future. My personal methodology is that we don't constrained by the current situation. My idea is that we should project a vision in the future, and that is not bound by anything, any real situation now. And then we come back to now, the situation, and then we try to find the pathway to go to that idealist goal. And during the process, we revise and amend our strategy from time to time. So I think it's still very important to go back to see the value thing. And then one more thing is that Malaysia is has a democratic system. And then the policy, although foreign policy usually is not decided by the constituency directly, but it's decided by political leaders. So political leaders, they will have to have a general, comprehensive thinking, both domestically and internationally. So that is the foreign policy thinking, how that is made. So the political leaders, they can try and they will find out the way. And there are many dramatic change in real politics. For instance, like some years ago, you don't expect that Malaysia will have a 94 years old leader again, right? So the real world is always very dramatic and out of any others, anyone's imagination. So I think it's no harm, and it's very helpful for us to think from the very fundamental, and then not to bind by all the reality constraints.
What you say is very much in line with the Clinton's theme song for his election. Don't stop thinking about tomorrow. So,
let me make three very quick points. The first, Tan Sri, your point about ZOP Fund, which is interesting. You know, Malaysia has pride of place in the conceptualizing of ZOP Fund, 1971, right? The KL Declaration. But it is interesting to ask the question why there was no traction, right? And I think the reason, in fact, when it was articulated as an aspiration for ASEAN. So in a sense, it's still a live document for ASEAN today, but it was never picked up, I think, because of the realities of how they conceptualized ZOP Fund in 1971. Because when they conceptualized it, the idea of neutrality basically was understood as keeping the external powers out of Southeast Asia. Immediately after it was signed, the United States demonstrated its view on that concept by sailing its aircraft carrier right through Southeast Asia, and we couldn't do anything about it, right? And that, I suppose, is the reality. But the reality has changed today, right? Because whereas in 71, we were talking about keeping external powers out of the region, today we are talking about integrating them into the region in a constructive way, right? So that's the challenge for ASEAN, to have that same spirit, but to think of how to manage the engagement of external powers in the region in a constructive way, which is why ASEAN centrality, you know, much maligned as it may be, is a very important concept. And that brings me to my second point about ASEAN. I personally feel that ASEAN is in an inflection point, which is useful because we celebrated 50 years, right? For a long time, ASEAN was about the meeting in itself, right? The meeting was the end in itself, not a means to an end. And that has always been the disconnect in the diplomatic culture between those of us in Southeast Asia, perhaps in the larger Asia region as well, and our friends from a more Western liberal background. The Americans were always giving us grief about meetings not getting anywhere, and they couldn't quite accept the fact that we can sit down and meet is already an achievement, you know, and in
poisoning the food.
So in a certain context, I think that was very true, you know. But having said that, I think the challenges that the region faces, the challenges that all our societies face, you know, with technology, with the cyber world, etc., we need to think beyond that. And I think ASEAN realizes that. So it will take a while, but I'm fairly confident that ASEAN can eventually start to, you know, slow and laborious as it may be, to start this process of recalibrating the thinking. It is complicated by the fact that we have you know, they call it a two-tier ASEAN. We have a more strategic thinking core ASEAN, perhaps including Vietnam in that group, but we have Laos, Cambodia, you know, who and perhaps Myanmar, who are sort of at a different level at this point in time. I'm not talking about economic development, but just their idea of regionalism. So this will take a while. My last point, actually, Tong, is in response. It was prompted by a remark you made about how you encourage the Chinese to work with Mahathir now, which I agree. But then you went on to say that, you know, so as to set a framework for relations maybe for the next 20-25 years. You know, in Singapore, we always thought that Lee Kuan Yew and Deng Xiaoping had come to an understanding, and when the relationship got bad, we told the Chinese, look, we had an understanding, you know, No. See, it blew up eventually, but the Chinese said for some time already, you know, China was changing, you know. So you know, factor that into your equation.
So we are talking about Southeast Asia, but China always be the focal point. So I have several answers towards all the questions. The first, my impression is one identity with great diversity. So I happen to know all the speakers here are Chinese or Huayan, but with great diversity. I'm a mainland Chinese. He is a Singapore Chinese. Our host may be Malaysia America Chinese. So Mr. Jou is a Taiwan Chinese and Malaysian Chinese. So it so happened, but it's interesting. So we can sit together to talk about, we have a different academic point, we have different political statement. So it's quite good. I appreciate this discussion as a first. The second, because it's an academic discussion, we must respect academic discipline. So I want to correct some concept first. The first is a country. We know among 5 of us, we have 2 kinds of cross streets. One is Singapore and Malaysia cross streets. The other is mainland Taiwan cross streets. But the nature of the 2 kinds of cross streets is totally different. Singapore and Malaysia is a sovereignty versus sovereignty. Mainland and Taiwan, we are one country. So country is just a concept can use China, the PRC. Taiwan is just one part of China. It's very academically, both not only academically but also politically. So the first concept. The second concept is ASEAN manners or ASEAN Plus. ASEAN Plus is a golden doctrine of ASEAN. I don't think ASEAN manners will be workable. So Minister Zheng Dong mentioned we should have ASEAN manners. It's a very, academic speaking, it's a very dangerous idea. So you can think about Trump just give up all kinds of membership of international organizations. So it's highly possible for Trump to quit the membership of East Asia Summit. East Asia Summit means the 10 countries of ASEAN as a group and 8 regional or global powers in a same platform. This means all the 18 parties respect the collective security. We have a common norm. We can imagine if Trump just quit the membership of the East Asia Summit, it means it will use the military allies discipline to solve the problem in Southeast Asia. But the base of the East Asia Summit is a treaty of amity and cooperation. It's the root of ASEAN. So I don't think ASEAN manners is a good idea. So I have a friendly reminder to our minister. We must be careful as a policy maker when you have some academic idea. So it's I want to make a correction of the concept. And the third, the other concept is a Thucydides trap. This is a very good alarm to China. It means the war is not inevitable. The war is not imaginable. But the most dangerous thing is a self-fulfilling effect. So if anybody believes China is an enemy, if all the East Asian countries believe Taiwan is an ally with the nature of a country, it's so difficult. So why China has the expansion of the budget of the military? So the fear of China is if all the countries believe Taiwan is allies, we indeed need more military made up. So it's academic. And I think China appreciates efforts made by Taiwan, made by Southeast Asia at the beginning of the reform. So last year is 40 years of open reform. So what's the contribution for China right now? Maybe the Belt and Road Initiative. It's public goods for the development. For example, infrastructure. So right now we can see many infrastructure projects in Malaysia. So if Taiwan is willing to do that, I think more projects, infrastructure will be happening in Taiwan. So it's a contribution by mainland. So last one, maybe, I don't think China is a superpower. We have some indicators for superpower. First, we must be a united country, but we are not. We must have a strong soft power. We have no strong soft power. We have so many ethnic Chinese, but we have various ideas. And you know our soccer team game is so weak. So we are not a superpower. So we must be very careful to use superpower right now. And my last suggestion to Malaysia, very shortly, seconds. My suggestion is to Malaysia is I don't think middle power is a proper concept for Malaysia. I don't think Mahathir will agree with middle power. Middle power is a concept by Australia. Australia is always, a bad impression for Mahathir. So I insist on my idea, a connected power. It will be very neutral, very smart, very proper concept for Malaysia. So I've finished here. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Yes, that's what the search is. For Malaysia to be a connected power, it is connected to China, the United States, and to Taiwan. So that is true neutrality. Thank you all for coming and have a good weekend.